Genetic engineering is a process where scientists take genes from one species and force it into the DNA of other species.
Every single independent study conducted on the impact of genetically modified food shows that it damages organs, it causes infertility, it causes immune system failure, it causes holes in the GI tract, it causes multiple organ system failure.
The whole concept of genetically modified organisms is throwing a monkey wrench in the life on this planet.
What if we could produce more yield on the same amount of land, squeeze more water from a single raindrop, conserve natural resources while caring for the environment?
Monsanto is the company that told us that they told us that Agent Orange was safe. They told us that DDT was safe, and now they're in charge of telling us if their own genetically modified foods are safe.
The reason why we have 170 million acres of genetically engineered corn and soybeans and cotton and canola oil and sugar beets in the United States is because it doesn't have to be labeled.
The nutritional label that appears on the side of your cereal box might tell you about how much fat and calories you're consuming, but one thing that's missing is the information of any of its ingredients if they were genetically modified. So this week, the Senate Agriculture Committee approved a bill that would prevent states from creating their own mandatory food labeling laws for GMOs. Now, environmental groups say it'll prevent Americans from really knowing what's in their food, but legislators who voted in favor of it say labeling puts too much burden on the farmers, the ranchers, and the consumer. So Alexis Baden-Mayer, political director of the Organic Consumers Association, is joining me now to talk about this legislation. Alexis, what is up? What is behind this effort to override states' own GMO laws?
Corporate money. And you can look at who funds the senators who voted for this. Senator Klobuchar, for instance, in Minnesota.
Not a single human being on earth gets up and says, boy, I can't wait to go to the supermarket and buy a GMO food. And why is that? That's because after 30 years and hundreds of billions of dollars of public and private investment, they haven't been able to come up with one thing in this food that actually helps the consumer. No better taste, no lower price, no more nutrition, nothing, zip, zero, nada. 85% of all the genetically engineered crops in this country and around the world are designed so you can soak them with weed killers, toxic herbicides. And who are the big companies that do this? Come on, you know who they are. Monsanto, anybody, what? Who else? DuPont, Dow Chemical, Syngenta, Bayer. What kind of companies are these? Chemical companies.
The UK government gave about $3 million to a scientist to figure out how to test for the safety of GMOs. That scientist was Dr. Arpad Pusztai, the world's leading expert in his field. He worked at the top nutritional research laboratory in the UK, one of the best in the world. He had about 20 or 30 researchers working with him in 3 different institutes, and his protocols that he was designing were supposed to be implemented into EU law as requirements for the safety assessments of any GMOs to be introduced into Europe. He took a potato that was genetically engineered to produce an insecticide and fed one group of rats the genetically engineered potato. He fed another group of rats natural potatoes, and a third group of rats natural potatoes, plus their meal was spiked with the same insecticide that the GM potato was engineered to produce. So you have GM potato, natural potato, and natural potato plus an insecticide, and all 3 had a complete and balanced diet as well.
We measured all sorts of things, growth, for example, how these young animals were growing, what happened to their inside, and what happened to their immune system. And it became clear that the GM had a slower growth. It had problems with internal development of its organs, and it certainly knocked out the immune system.
Only the rats that ate the GM potato got sick. They had potentially precancerous cell growth in their digestive tract, smaller brains, livers, and testicles, partial atrophy of the liver, damaged immune system in 10 days. What was the cause of that damage? It was not the insecticide because the group eating the insecticide did not have the problem. It was understood that it was the process of genetic engineering itself and the unpredicted side effects that caused this profound damage to every system and organ studied.
It was clear that our regulatory system ensures biotechnology crops are among the most tested in the history of agriculture. Thus, it is clear that what we're facing today is not a safety or health issue, it is a market issue.
Well, Senator Roberts knows that we don't test GMOs for safety. We do this substantial equivalence. So if GMO corn and regular corn have sort of the same nutrition, then we'll assume that they're the same in terms of safety as well. That's our regulatory system.
But now he's
Name a few.
If you take the gene of a cow that helps it to produce milk, that produces a hormone called the bovine growth hormone, and if you take that hormone and you start injecting into the cow, the idea here is then the cow will produce more milk. The companies like Monsanto and Eli Lilly, who invented this hormone independently, and they said there's nothing wrong in doing that because it's substantially the same hormone that the cow produces. That is wrong. Because even if you take natural bovine growth hormone and you give injections of it to cows, then the cows will get sick. Just like if you took human insulin and you started to inject human insulin back to people, they will get insulin shock, they could die. But the cow receiving this hormone will actually be sick. It'll have pus in its milk because it's producing too much milk. The teat canal of the cows will get infected, will have to be treated with antibiotics.
In 2001, a small California biotech company called Epicite patented a gene, which causes both men and women who eat it in the form of any product to produce antibodies to sperm. If the men eat the Epicite gene, they produce antibodies to their own sperm, rendering them irreversibly sterile. If women eat the Epicite gene, when they have intercourse, their bodies produce antibodies to the sperm that has been deposited, and they become infertile through the destruction of the sperm. Now, DuPont and Monsanto formed a joint venture, purchased the Epicite firm, and, quote, commercialized the Epicite gene. Do you want to know if the food that you're eating contains the Epicite gene? Sure you do. How about the food that your children are eating, or your grandchildren? Sure you do.
There has been no long-term research on the concept or consequences of what this genetic modification does, not just to us, but to the environment. And right now, from all the research that's showing up, it says this has a very negative and profound effect on destroying the environment in which we live. So therefore, I find it senseless that the government would support and condone genetically modified foods without even having the basic research to understand the liabilities involved in creating these monster organisms and putting them into our world.
No genetically modified crop can grow unless it's attached to some kind of a pesticide. Those pesticides, more and more, are in these plants. They may have killed the weeds, they may have killed the insects, but the product is still on the plants. And if it's washed off, then it's in the water, it gets into the lakes, it gets into the oceans, it's everywhere. And it's toxic, it causes cancer, it also causes endocrine disruption. That's a technical term for change of hormones. They don't even want to label that this is genetically modified. The milk is genetically modified, or the crop is genetically modified. They say, if we label that, we won't be able to sell it because people won't buy it. Of course, people won't buy it because people don't want it.
We have thousands of different varieties of any given food crop you can mention. And by simply dipping in to this already existing reservoir of varieties of crops, resurrecting old crop varieties which have been displaced, could readily meet our food needs without having to resort to the risky procedures associated with GM.
What is an
What if we could produce more yield on the same amount of land, squeeze more water from a single raindrop, conserve natural resources while caring for the environment?
Monsanto is the company that
herbicide-resistant crop. It's a crop that you can spray the hell out of it with a toxic chemical and it won't die. It kills everything except that particular crop. And so you have the ability not only to sell the seeds to the farmer, you're going to sell them the companion pesticide. So you get two sales for one, and they're going to have to come back to you every year and get them because once you start applying these poisons on this scale, your farmland is so devastated that to convert to organic, for example, is economically difficult.
the most comprehensive analysis of GMOs shows that they actually reduce yield. But sustainable technologies, they can increase yield by an average of 79%.
We label everything from the contents of our mattresses to our clothing to our hand sanitizers, all the way to the hairspray that we use. But at the moment, there is no federal law that says we should have the same for the food that we consume, even though 9 out of 10 people across all socioeconomic strata, age groups, and genders all agree that food makers should be compelled to label foods as GMO or genetically modified. Why then is Senate Agriculture Chairman Pat Roberts pushing draft legislation intended to stop this from happening? Senator Roberts unveiled legislation that would make it illegal to force states to label foods as genetically modified. At the moment, the FDA does not require labels on food derived from genetically engineered plants because existing law says that there must be a, quote, material difference between GE products and its natural counterpart. But to clarify, the FDA does not carry the force of law behind them, and it's ultimately up to lawmakers on the Hill to make it the law of the land. Now, proponents of Roberts' bill say this is the best step to take to prevent a patchwork of legislation that varies from state to state. People like Pamela Bailey, the president of the Grocery Manufacturers Association. Now, Bailey says that this is a common sense solution, but those who are pushing for transparency in our food labeling, such as chairman of Stonyfield Farm and Just Label It, Gary Hirschberg, he said, quote, allowing food companies to make voluntary disclosures will simply perpetuate the status quo that has left consumers in the dark. Stonyfield Farm is, of course, a leading organic food maker best known for their organic yogurts and dairy products. So this so-called DARK Act is similar to H.R. 1599, the Safe and Accurate Food Labeling Act of 2015, which passed the House back in June. It expanded the definition of the word natural, which in the food industry is actually quite different than the word organic. So even processed foods like potato chips can be called natural, even though they contain GMOs, which adds to a lot of consumer confusion. Now, while the DARK Act probably won't pass the Senate, the big food corporations lobbying for its passage will likely find other ways to piggyback other legislation, one word at a time. In Washington, Manila Chan, RT